Hi everyone, thank you all for joining us today. We have a few more minutes before we get started, but thank you all for waiting. Okay, so it is now 1 p.m. Eastern, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from today. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar today on Resiliency Means Business, Preparing for Risk to Safe and Reliable Service. My name is Avery Davis, and I am from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to cover a few housekeeping items, and then we'll get started. During the training today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information you may need. You can also download the slides from today and a resource document in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This session has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire webinar, register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. And if you have any questions or need assistance, please contact us at smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about the Environmental Finance Center Network. We provide training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all U.S. states and territories to help local water systems achieve their goals and stay in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. If you or your community needs assistance with drinking water system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. And on that note, we can get started. So I would like to introduce our presenter for today. We have Dr. Jack Cortez, the Senior Advisor and Emeritus Director at the New England Environmental Finance Center at the University of Southern Maine. So Jack, welcome, and I'm going to pass everything over to you.
Okay, thank you, Avery. And just let me check, you can hear me okay, yes?
Yep, everything sounds great.
Okay, well, welcome to our participants today. Resilience, is a sprawling topic covering a range of concepts and approaches. We're going to focus on access to available tools and some general concepts for utility resilience efforts. This brief review is meant as a gateway to these resources and ideas to support your own follow-up. Today's short session is not going to be interactive, and there isn't time for case studies of other systems, which are really useful. We certainly use them in our online and in-person workshops, You'll be getting a tools overview document to download, as Avery mentioned, with links to such resources. We'll try to answer a few questions before closing, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. First, a note about U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's efforts, the source of many of the free tools we'll be looking at today. An extensive and multifaceted resource has been developed in programs of the EPA Water Security Division, or WSD, and its related programs such as the Creating Resilient Water Utilities Initiative, known as CREW. For the comprehensive and concise list of all WSD tools and related resources, you can see this products and services list. It's the first of over 24 links you'll find in that guided tools document you can download today. We'll cover a lot in a short time this hour. Hopefully it won't be too much like drinking from the data fire hose. So here's the typical 50,000-foot definition of resilience, which you can read. It could apply to any business, organization, system, or your mind. And here's the agenda for what we'll be discussing. We'll start briefly with what is considered the core of lifeline utility resilience, emergency planning. We'll be building a view of resilience management as more than incident response and as an ongoing business practice. We'll spend half the time on risk assessment and the growing challenge of uncertainty, some of which has to do with climate uncertainty, but not all. We'll look at strategies for prioritizing what risks to act on in the face of uncertainty. We'll look at some best practices using frameworks for that total approach. Some of these have been piloted by an alliance of some of America's largest water utilities, and we'll look at the potential value for small utilities. So let's take a quick poll, Avery, of where our large group today is on emergency and resilience planning at present. Avery is opening the poll. I can't see it, of course.
It's up now, and we're only going to leave it up for about 30 seconds, so make sure you get your answers in. All right, I'm closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Can you see those results, Jack?
Let me see if I can. I cannot.
So it looks like 9% answered that they have an emergency response plan, but no other resiliency efforts. 29% answered they have an emergency response plan and some resiliency efforts. 7% have answered they have emergency planning or resiliency efforts that are inactive. And 13% answered they have no emergency or resilience efforts in recent years.
Okay, so we have quite a spread of situations today, and hopefully there'll be something for everybody in here during the hour. So let's start with basics, as in the agenda. The basic risk standard of care for water sector utilities is currently defined by Section 2013 of the America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018, or AWIA. Utilities of different service sizes have been given deadlines for certifying that they've completed a risk and resilience self-assessment. And you can see the deadlines here, all of which have passed for the first time. Most of you are probably aware of this. This is a self-certification to EPA. It does not require submitting a document. The requirement applies to systems serving more than 3,300, but my pitch is that risk assessment as the foundation for resilience is valuable for all of our small systems too, scaled appropriately to your situation and resources. AWIA covers both natural hazards and human-caused malevolent acts like cyber security attacks. AWIA also sets an expectation that systems will update or create emergency response plans. Now, EPA provides an emergency response plan template for drinking water utilities to meet AWIA requirements. This is the first of the many EPA tools we'll be looking at very briefly today. This comprehensive template includes links to many useful incident-specific response procedures, also known as rip and run checklists. It's an excellent resource for your emergency planning and as a basis for working with your area's emergency management agency and local emergency planning committee, LEPC, and your state WARN program. the water and wastewater agency response networks. If you aren't a member of your WARN, if you have a system you're responsible for, you should be. But understanding risk and resilience broadly is the main focus here. Now, traditional hazard vulnerability assessment has long been part of emergency response planning. I've been involved in hazards and disaster work for 40 years, and we've seen a lot of this. But risk and hazard vulnerability assessment, while involving similar tasks, risk has more of a connection to evaluating risk reduction choices and prioritization based on criteria such as net benefits, among others. One of the things we've observed over decades in hazards management is lots of vulnerability assessments and less action on risk reduction, which requires the challenge of setting priorities and then facing the challenge of making the choices happen. So 2 foundation tools from EPA for beginning water sector risk assessment are the Vulnerability Self-Assessment Tool, or VSAT, and the parallel but much more simplified Small System Risk and Resilience Assessment Checklist, which you see displayed here with a couple of clips. The Small Water Systems Checklist is recommended for those serving over 3,300 connections up to 50,000. And is a straightforward pencil and paper tool for identifying by your judgment what the user sees as the most significant risks from a list of selected natural hazards and malevolent acts, and an extensive list of assets and business functions that could be affected. So this is a terrific starting guide, particularly for small systems. Now, we're going to talk a bit about VSAT. So here's a comparison of the checklist for small systems versus VSAT. For small systems without asset management, the checklist is a good heads up on its importance. You should have asset management of some kind. The simpler checklist analysis can meet the certification requirement for small systems under AWEA. The hazards listed do not cover a number of additional climate change related threats like drought, heat, consequent source water changes, and sea level rise. But you can add such categories either to the small systems checklist or to VSAT. So now we're going to talk about VSAT for a while. VSAT involves much more than the checklist, going beyond the initial judgment list of significant risks called the qualitative risk assessment, which is in both, to an analysis in VSAT for each chosen threat and affected asset of the expected likelihood of the threat and the financial, life safety, and other consequences, or what we call a quantitative and, when possible, monetized dollars and cents assessment that it can include estimating both the costs of consequences, the impact, and the possible costs and benefits of investing in countermeasures. Now, VSAT on the web uses much preloaded information and data to help you, but it also requires a good deal of specific judgments. Without going into detail beyond our hour, VSAT uses some preloaded data such as likelihood rates for included threats based on national experience. VSAT can also use a national damage calculator called WEAT to produce a planning level or scoping assessment of the cost and consequences expected, again, based on some user inputs. This can be a step to follow-up investigation of risk reduction countermeasures. So the VSAT tool is housed on the web. Its use requires learning its operation, which is straightforward, but it's not nothing. The software does not save the analysis at EPA, and EPA always stresses this. They don't get it. You download your copy locally, and it serves as the basis for your AWEA self-certification. Now, it's worth opening VSAT even for smaller systems. I really want to pitch this. To use the research-based Utility Resilience Index. The Utility Resilience Index uses the very first inputs that you're asked to add, which any system can answer. You can see some of the 12 category index is about emergency incident response preparations in the list on the right of your slide, but the rest is about business continuity robustness, including flow capacities, workforce capacities, general financial health, asset management, and the general socioeconomic resilience of your service area with your ratepayers. This gives you a comparison to other utilities on a scale of 100 nationally, and this can be a useful first heads-up tool for communicating with your board and other stakeholders, and for beginning your internal discussions. Can't recommend it enough. The index also reflects a message that we have that resilience is built on the strength of your ongoing business functions and practices. Capable crisis response is not something pulled off a shelf in the moment. In-depth resilience management looks at questions like, are you only one deep on some personnel roles? Or do you have cross-training or other robust workforce investments that you can call on? Does your financial health, which may have to absorb emergency expenditures that you cannot avoid, also allow for needed ongoing maintenance and capacity development investments that you should be choosing to do? Are your rates sufficient to your needs? And so on. The index is a good, fast exercise to use early in your resilience effort. And we'll talk about structuring the process of resilience management a little later. So now we turn to a further look at risk, identifying and prioritizing risk, and dealing with uncertainty about the future. The basic risk equation The basic risk equation shown here arose from engineering and decision research to convert uncertainty to risk so it can be assessed and acted upon. Keep this equation in mind. A threat has to be connected to an asset. It has to have some consequences and a likelihood that it'll happen. That's the risk. Here's a few terms from EPA's VSAT that applies to any risk assessment that you're doing. First, major risk areas to assess include not only natural and human caused hazards, but also accidents of your geography or proximity. Is your source water proximate to a possible threat like industrial contamination, for example? That's why AWEA calls out the need to connect with your local emergency planning committee or LEPC, because they know what toxics and hazardous chemicals are in use around you. Second, pairing up your assets and hazard threats is a basic step in any of these approaches. Asset threat pairs. You can't analyze all risks at once. That's analysis paralysis. So you have to focus on some pairs that are most significant. And we'll talk about how you judge that significance. So this matrix in the next slide shows a standard engineering view of risk levels, a necessary step in prioritizing what to act on. Well, this works well with assets or industrial processes where there's some known probability information, for example, on failure incidents of equipment or processes. Even weather reports or hurricane tracking routinely sets probabilities based on mathematical models of physical processes. But you don't have such probability information on the actual likelihood of many threats that might hit you. The VSAT tool does use historical odds of some events like tornadoes or hurricanes in different regions to give you some idea of where to start. You're still going to have to make judgments. For weather-related events, the non-stationarity of climate processes is a new challenge. What's that? Non-stationarity is the technical term for a simple fact. In many places, climate minimums and maxima are changing. That makes the behavior of many natural hazard and everyday weather events different, usually not to our advantage these days. So history is no longer as good a guide to future likelihood, but we can judge something about trends, where things seem to be going based on our research and evidence to date. Exact predictions are not very realistic, but trend information, which still involves some range of probabilistic uncertainty, is vital, and it is practical. Scenario planning, which some or many of you are probably familiar with, has become widely used to support decisions about trend uncertainty and to try on different strategies for action, especially suited to comparing alternative futures with different assumptions about what change to deal with. Big change, little change, or what. But even with scenarios, risk judgments still need to be made. Where to start? Here's the simple but useful model I like for organizing thinking about risk for resilience at your enterprise. Let's look at how you could use this to parse up risks into priorities, but also to think about changing trends and uncertainty. The lower left and upper right boxes or cells are least important in some ways. Low likelihood and low impacts, the lower left green cell, are obviously not so consequential. And the upper right red cell, highly likely threats with large consequences, are clearly a high priority. But these risks are represented by things like a hurricane bearing down on you. The exact landing's not entirely known, but pretty likely, and the event is a sure thing in your region. We typically take these pretty seriously, but the response time frame from the warning signal about a looming threat to possible action is actually pretty short. So, more challenging for risk prioritization are the other two boxes, the kind of orangish boxes. Here's why, and I'd like you to think about how you would fill these in for your own system, as we would in a longer training session. The lower right-hand cell includes those low likelihood but highly negative consequence risks that are the most difficult to plan for in some ways. They don't happen often, if at all, and we don't know when they might happen, but they could happen, and the stakes are too large to ignore. In practice, these risks are often prioritized too low. Why? Because the time frames are so stretched out, the actual time of impact so unclear, and the costs of spending on anticipatory but possibly never needed risk reduction may be too great in the face of the more immediate and pressing needs that everybody has. Of course, the poster child for this kind of risk, high consequence, low probability, HPLC, is a nuclear power plant accident. I'll leave you to reflect on that. So now let's turn to the upper left-hand box, the lesser consequence but more likely risks. These include what we can refer to as nuisance hazards or chronic operational problems, but can change their nature and are changing because of external forces. An increasingly troublesome example of the resilience challenge in these high likelihood or higher likelihood but low consequence or routine risks are nuisance floods from stormwater events, ponding in the streets, minor discharge issues with sewer works, wet basements, or maybe wet generator shacks or electrical rooms at your system, all of which happen much more often than a big emergency or a disaster. Well, over the last 20 years, many previously minor events have greater impact due to more intense precipitation patterns in some areas, even those that have also experienced droughty periods, like our friends in Worcester here. Stormwater works have blown out, equipment has been damaged, source water quality has been threatened. In some regions, 100-year events are now 50 to 25-year events in return rates. After Superstorm Sandy, favorite story, the New York governor met the president and said, "Mr. President, now we have 100-year floods every year." The reason is that rainfall event behavior is changing. That's non-stationarity. So going back to this slide, if you look at this example of a monthly average temperature by month graph, you can see that the red shows that the averages are changing. What does that mean? It means that the extremes are also changing too in the probability distribution of what could happen. So the takeaway here is to keep your eye on the upper left-hand risks for changing trends and maybe changes in your priorities. This can apply to all your business functions. What's happening with your access to a needed workforce, to your service population's ability to afford needed rates? Upper left-hand risks becoming more significant may become potential priorities. Of course, the decision to prioritize risks is also affected by other factors. Let's be realistic. One is criticality. Is the risk to an asset or function the one that would have big impacts on your service continuity? That's criticality. Another is feasibility. Can you afford mitigation, however much it's needed? Financing is not the focus of this session, but it's a key concern of the EFC network. We do a lot of work on this. Happy to respond on finance always, and also by others helping our utilities, such as rural water across the country and your state revolving fund agency in your state. It is worth noting that not only is the nature of funding opportunities changing, there are now some funds available for pre-disaster risk reduction, such as FEMA's excellent BRIC program, but there is also a once-in-a-generation flow of funds from the American Rescue Plan Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Identifying your resilience risks is a necessary starting point to tap into any of these resources. Once some priorities are judged, here are two useful planning and analysis tools from EPA's Creating Resilient Water Utilities Initiative, or CREW, within the Water Securities Division. These are in a set with other information resources, including a superb national case study library and basic climate trends information tools, which actually we'll look at briefly. Although developed with the climate adaptation focus, the CREW suite of tools can support broader resilience management, and it's highly recommended. So let's look at the first of these tools, the Resilient Strategies Guide. So let's say you've identified priority threats to specific assets. You've got a set of asset threat pairs that are most important. The RSG Strategies Guide is a tool for identifying risk reduction actions and beginning to evaluate them for their benefits and feasibility. Preloaded information in the tool is again a beneficial aspect, like inventories of mitigation actions for covered threats and some at least generalized cost information. The orientation to climate does not include human-caused malevolent acts like cyber attacks, nor some other natural hazards like earthquakes. And I need to stress that under AWEA, malevolent acts are now a very high priority. The national risk level for them for water systems has been raised from fractions of a percent to 1.0, meaning plan for cybersecurity all the time, every year. But some fundamental risk reduction categories that are covered by the Strategies Guide give a very good heads up. For example, one is communications, which frankly, having been involved in emergency planning education for a long time, is an often overlooked aspect of both emergency and resilience management. The Strategies Guide also directs you to specific case studies available from the library for the threat asset pairs you've chosen. So let's look just briefly at some of the steps of operation in the Strategies Guide and recap the tools so far. The VSAT tool is quite comprehensive in taking you through identifying both natural systems and malevolent caused risks and starting to identify priorities, as you see on the left. The small systems checklist, by comparison, provides for a simplified assessment. The Strategies Guide we're discussing at this point also focuses on pairing up the assets and threats with a climate focus. The RSG delivers suggested reduction strategies, available case examples, and funding source suggestions. So you can see the progression in this slide showing now, ending with a little funding opportunities library. The list of strategies is really an education in itself in this guide. So let's move on from the Strategies Guide and talk about climate focus. The next type of tool from CREW is specifically built to support dealing with long-range climate change information. It involves a series of updated natural hazards and climate trend interactive data maps. These include an introductory climate scenario builder for trends in either 2035 and 2060, with the ability to choose the magnitude of change indicated by the scenario chosen from the 40 existing global climate models currently used in the IPCC fourth assessment for the high emission future scenario. So shown here is a page for 2035 temperature change under a chosen hotter, drier scenario for the Midwest in the United States. The maps also cover precipitation, storm intensity, heat, and sea level trends. Now, there are many limitations to large-scale model information, but trends are well represented, and unfortunately, trends are becoming more confident as we approach 2030. The probability uncertainty is actually declining. The process of choosing scenarios is a vital step in long-range resilience planning, even for business, let alone climate. For any of you who've had some brush with strategic management planning, also an important function at a system. So let's move on from the climate information tools suite And I really recommend you look at the scenarios tool. It's very easy to use, so you can flip around in it, but it really gives you a feel for what the scenarios business is all about. So last is kind of the prize of the Creating Resilient Water Utilities suite of tools, the Climate Resilience Evaluation and Awareness Tool, or CREATE. CREATE was developed specifically for water utility planning for the longer-term climate risks and associated hazards. It uses the future scenario planning resource we just covered as the first step in the climate awareness model at the top of the stack, and then the scenario development module that follows it. CREATE's distinctive function is that it carries the economic benefit cost analysis of potential risk reduction actions further than any of the other tools. The aim is to help support initial project scoping based on whether the estimated monetized risk reduction choices will result in avoided losses in the future that may create economic benefits that are equal to or greater than the cost of the actions. In other words, this is a rudimentary benefit cost analysis tool, and either the 2035 or 26 timeframes can be used. And as with all the other tools, identifying asset threat pairs is the basic step. So CREATE includes a great deal of preloaded information on typical costs of assets, dollar levels of possible damages to such assets, and you can substitute more precise local figures at any stage. Now, these economic monetized cost estimates are ranges in the tool, because that's the only realistic way to do this. And you'll see how that plays out in the tool. But again, it gives you some brackets for beginning to zero in on things at your system. Any engineer will tell you, and some of you are engineers, that this kind of back of the envelope coming to phase one, analysis is really where you need to start thinking about projects. Details about CREATE are way beyond this webinar. The CREW website includes recordings of a number of the 4-session training webinars that have been held in different regions of the country. I've attended 4 of them, helped with one of them years ago. They are great sessions. Let me just show one slide of some final CREATE outputs that we're going to talk about, and a useful concept for dealing with climate planning uncertainty. As with other risk assessment tools, assets and threats must be paired to analyze them. So shown are several dial-like graphics that CREATE produces for 3 different asset threat pairs and proposed mitigation projects in response to that chosen pair within the specific scenario choices that have been made. And don't worry about what all these specifically are. All 3 of these dials are from different utilities, different projects, different scenarios and situations. But we're using them to talk about dealing with uncertainty. The graphic labeled 1 in the lower left shows mostly red on the dial. Everybody zero in on that. So what this means is that the range of possible avoided economic losses for the given scenario, as analyzed in CREATE, given the user inputs, are almost entirely less than the range of costs of the proposed risk reduction and possible benefits in the value of the avoided loss. In other words, it's very likely that it's not even a wash. It would just be throwing money after something that can't be achieved. Now, maybe that could change. Maybe a change in the reduction strategy and design is needed. Maybe the timing needs to be different. Maybe it needs to be in the future. We're going to talk about what that means. But this gives you a heads up that it doesn't look so great. And to tell you the truth, I've been through bunches of CREATE results, and a lot of them look like this, but that tells you something. So there's little overlap indicating that no net monetized gain and avoided future losses is likely from the expenditure now. Now, the second example, labeled 2, shows a lot of orange. What does that mean? This means that there is a lot of overlap between the range of cost of the analyzed mitigation expenditure and the range of estimated risk loss in dollars that could be avoided by investing in that action and the cost of the action. That means that given the reality that we're dealing with ranges, there's some room where this might have a payoff. What does that mean, practically speaking? We have to be practical. This category may rate a look into this further and be ready to act conclusion, maybe going to the next phase of assessment of it. Because as you know, when you start a project of any kind, even a kind of conventional normal investment in your treatment process and your works, you can't just decide today you're going to do it tomorrow. It takes a lot of planning ahead in various ways in terms of every aspect, engineering, finance, and the politics of it as well in most or many cases. So the third result in the upper right shows that the estimated avoided losses of the example, in this case it's a flood protection plan, exceed 2/3 of the estimated costs of the risk reduction countermeasures and the expected avoided losses. There's lots of green. Now there's still a chance, you can see a little bit of red on the lower left of that dial, number 3. There's still a little chance that if the avoided loss estimate was mistakenly way too high, we thought it was going to be much better than it will be. And if the mitigation cost estimate was way too low, this is going to be cost plus, it's way more than we thought. Well, it might not be a net gain project. Well, there's a risk in that, but it merits proceeding with next stage planning. That's kind of the lesson here. Let's tighten up the numbers for real. Now, obviously, as mentioned earlier, there are other considerations for these decisions, including local economic benefits and public health and life safety aspects, such as will you avoid threats to life and limb, and CREATE actually includes such details, which we can't cover here, but you can put them into an analysis in a more kind of qualitative, generalized way. Obviously, we can't cover that here. CREATE basic training takes 4 2-hour sessions. It's great training, but it does take that to understand the tool. But a concept I want you to focus on here as a take home is this 3-stage decision ladder to deal with uncertainty, shown in the upper left. This is an approach increasingly used to stage action on future but still uncertain trends. Water utilities are used to making long-range expensive decisions, probably better than anybody else in local government. But there's value in this additional idea, which is coming to be used quite a bit in the climate adaptation arena. Some mitigation projects may not yet be ripe, given uncertainty about future trend severity, which we certainly have, but they might require preliminary preparations for planning to act, as I mentioned earlier, if these trends are going to continue, including a commitment to monitor change, monitor it seriously. So this is a sensible approach to prioritization beyond just wait when there's uncertainty. So the 3 stages are wait and see. It's way too early. So that is wait, but keep looking. And then this key middle stage, consider some plans, but we're not ready yet. But we're going to get some ducks in order. So we're not starting from ground zero. Green, I wouldn't say it's always, oh yes, push the button, but it's certainly, let's go into serious, upper phase study now. Now, another useful decision rule that again is being used increasingly and in big ways across the planet is choosing no regrets actions in the face of uncertainty. What does no regrets mean? Some of you may be familiar with this. I wish we were in person so I could see the hands raised. A project may have multiple benefits that make it a go. Upgrading treatment is also an opportunity to reduce vulnerability. Our EFC here in New England has worked with a small city wastewater utility that has just adopted such a major bonded project to deal with what are nuisance floods, but worsening because they're right on the banks of a major river opening to the Atlantic Ocean. And they are also going to retire some of their treatment process and upgrade it with a new process. So they're going to adopt a new process type. And they're also in the latter stages of dealing with a mandated CSO remediation for their combined stormwater works. And they're going to eliminate the flood risk. So after 2-3 years of looking into this, they were able to get this project bonded. It's not a small project for a small city. So now I'd like to talk about frameworks for getting your process started. The first example is, again, one of those free tools from EPA. How might you organize for an ongoing effort at your system? EPA's Route to Resilience tool is a good starting point. It's accessible, it's simple, it's straightforward, it's practical. Risk assessment is the first of 5 stages in a continuing operating cycle that is focused on emergency response and incident preparedness, and the conventional disaster management cycle of response, recovery, and replanning after mitigation. Mitigation isn't shown here, but it should be there. And the hazard management hierarchy is something I've been working with and communicating for a long time. But at any rate, the Route to Resilience tool is tailored to water utility needs. For example, a section under planning focuses on preparing for the heightened water testing needs you can face, whether from a natural event like flooding in your source water and transmission system, or a malevolent act like contamination, or a unintended contamination event from a proximate source of contamination. Do you know where you will tap needed testing capacity? This tool alerts you to some ways to start thinking about that, as well as risk communication, mutual aid, and other basics. It's all good. And shown here is what happens under assessment in this case. If you drill into the tool, you get suggestions for a basic heads up, where should you start, and then for a more advanced set of steps to work into the risk and resilience development at your place. And it gives you examples and links to tools. So it's a very useful first tool, linking you to all the other EPA tools that we've been discussing. But there's even more to this idea of having a framework for organizing resilience work for business continuity. The Water Utility Climate Alliance, or WUCA, is a collaboration of 12 large U.S. water utilities that have been working together for over a decade, with many other partners, including the Water Research Foundation, private enterprises, and many other nonprofits I don't have time to mention here, to develop methods for business resilience development in the face of climate change and other risks of change. And you can see the utilities here across the nation of the Water Utility Climate Alliance. One project has been to create frameworks for business resilience practices. The Water Research Foundation was one of their big partners in this. There's a lesson in this that can have value even for small and rural systems. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these frameworks, and then I'm going to tell you at least what I think the value lesson is for even smaller systems. So this is the premier framework of some others that they tested. Don't get alarmed. I wish we were in person so I could see the look on your face. This is a complicated slide of a framework that was tested by WUCA members, for example, Denver Water and San Francisco Water, Power, Sewer. What is this about? Well, it's a process for starting to work on resilience in the face of climate-related risks and opportunities, but with a focus from the start and throughout on also analyzing and understanding your business functions. Now that, frankly, is, I would consider it a pretty significant change in how historically we approached emergency preparedness planning. And it's particularly adapted here to lifeline utilities. So what does this mess mean? I'm leaving it up so you can go, oh, what is this? I can't read it. The document that you'll download today has links that'll take you right to WUCA, and you can look at this stuff for yourself. It has a link to an excellent webinar that is still posted by the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, another excellent resource these days. They had a webinar, 8th in a series they had a year or so back that is still available to watch on all this. It's very good on designing the utilities of the future. Well, let me give you a little guided investigation of this framework. First of all, if you look at the part that is circled in the middle here, doing a risk and vulnerability assessment, asset threat pairs, focus on business functions, of course, and then looking at mitigation actions, you know, kind of the and product over there in the upper right-hand column. That's right there. That's in the heart, that's in the core of this process, right? But there's all this other stuff. What kind of other stuff is there? Well, if we go back in this process a little, look at step 2B, prioritize mission critical business functions to assess. Now, this is something that you could be doing for any threat. It does not have to be about climate. In fact, as OEA started to stress a half dozen years ago, it probably needs to be about malevolent acts such as cyber terrorism. So this is a process that has some generality. And then it says under 2C, form a cross-functional working group or an exercise planning team, since one of the options in such a process is to do a serious, well-resourced and guided and assisted tabletop resilience planning and management exercise, which is kind of like an extension of the traditional emergency response tabletop exercise, because it's tied closely to pre-event planning. So this idea of forming a cross-functional working group is really important. I can't tell you how often there isn't, even in a small organization, cross-function, cross-role, cross-people communication to the extent that's necessary. You know, a group of my colleagues, most of them engineers, were some of the kind of research engineers helping with the massive central artery project in Boston, which of course is dealing with not flooding that lifeline transportation, you know, arterial with the ocean sitting next to it and on top of it. And one of the things they discovered in this extremely well-resourced many-year process is that some of the operational people knew of threat points, access points in the tunnels that really nobody else knew about. And what was termed institutional knowledge, or IK, by the, you know, the research types, but IK is a real thing. So this idea of circling the people together into a process to share knowledge back and forth is absolutely the essential lesson that I want to harp on. Now, another lesson is you got to get commitment to it, especially from, as it says here, an internal assessment leader, which also is in my book, it's kind of a polite terminology for you got to get buy-in from the top, whoever that may be, a GM, a board, key people. You got to all agree we're going to do this. Yes, it's something we don't have time for. Yes, we got to find resources for it, but it's important. We're going to do it as efficiently and productively as we possibly can. So that is the lesson. And also the idea that this is focused on business continuity and your basic business functions. Another resource from WUCA, the Big Utility Alliance, that I think is useful for any Lifeline utility is this leading practices project that they've had, which is all posted on their website. And one of the practices related to what I've just been harping on is the understand practice. I'm just going to read it. Understanding is continuous and foundational to climate adaptation work. That's what I just was talking about. Not just climate resilience work, all resilience work. And it focuses on understanding how your system functions along with its underlying conditions, the external environment and the internal environment, and key vulnerabilities. Any of you that have been dragged through a strategic planning process, this will seem familiar, but I think it's getting better and better for those of us dealing with risk and resilience. That's a foundation of all of this. So even in a small system where roles are only one deep, looking at risk information for common understanding, sharing understanding of how your critical business functions work together, it can have a payoff. Yes, daily needs are an obstacle, but that's a reason for adopting a framework process and saying, okay, we're going to start in on this and we're going to try and use the milestones to try to keep on it. Now, it looks like I have some extra time, so I'm going to flip ahead to cybersecurity, which I didn't think I would have time for today. And it's not because this isn't a must-do topic. It is, as I mentioned earlier, so we'll be able to spend just a couple of minutes on this with one other slide. As I mentioned earlier, in a advisory from the federal government via EPA on risks from malevolent acts on cybersecurity for Lifeline water utilities. About a year ago, if I remember correctly, the threat level for drinking water supply and community water supply utilities was 0.1, and for wastewater treatment works was 0.3. That's still a pretty significant risk. It's a lot more even at 0.1 than a 100-year flood. It's kind of like, yeah, we could have big rainfalls, so we better sort of be ready. That guidance, which you can read, raised it to 1.0, which, as I said earlier, means expect it, plan for it. What does planning for it mean? The document you're going to download today has links to several beginning resources, excellent resources, also in this arena, as discussed in the download tools document, the PDF. There are a couple of readily available sources of technical assistance at EPA and another agency, the Cyber Security Information Agency, both federal agencies, that you can access for help. Hundreds of utilities have been helped by this so far, even in the short time we've been trying to deal with this as a nation. But kind of step number one is to have good cyber hygiene, good practices. This is only about half of the list. These are really probably the top priority ones. Think before you click. I was working and training with a small city out in Idaho. I mean, like 300 water connections with the town administrator, young person, and we were going over cybersecurity in some detail in this training with several other people with small systems, board members actually in many cases. And we went over the good practice of if you have somebody in your organization who doesn't think before they click, if they do it once, they're bad. You make them go through some training, promise never to do it again, and download some malevolent attachment. But if they do it a second time, you take away their access to the system. You're bad if you don't. And this town manager said, I didn't know about this as training, but I had to do that with somebody. So it makes good sense. So highly recommended that you look at the cyber resources that are going to be readily available in your downloadable document. So now let me back up a little bit and talk about the Environmental Finance Center network. Easy to find at EFCN network, efcnetwork.org. The program that brings you this webinar and others, I know some of you have attended on other days, is the Building Technical, Managerial, and Financial Capacity for Small Water Systems project. DFCs also provide assistance under other programs, but this particular one is free when we have it, and it's continuing to run into probably early next year. So recommended that you look into contacting us for any assistance that you think you need. We have a variety of kinds of assistance, from creating an asset management plan to looking at your basic financial health, or going into resilience and hazard management and response preparedness in more depth in actual training. Water loss auditing and other technical topics have continued to be added, particularly with emphasis on wastewater as well. So take a good look. You can use this form to request somebody from our network of 10 centers. We'll get back to you based on our specialties. We can respond from across the entire network. And this is just a reminder that that guide is available. Thank you very much. You can see my email here, jackk@maine.edu. And I'm going to turn it back over to Avery to see what questions may have arisen. Avery, are you there?
Yes, I am. So thank you so much, Jack. Looks like we have no questions currently, so please go get those in if you have any. And in the meantime, I'm going to launch one final poll to gauge interest. If anyone here would be interested in learning more or discussing possible technical assistance with any of our experts, including Jack here. So I'm going to leave this up for a bit while we see if any additional questions roll in.
Right, we're going to give you a minute to look at this. And again, I'll have to rely on Avery to share the results with us. Actually, we won't share the results.
I'm going to leave it up for a couple more seconds. We'll close it in 3, 2, 1. So it looks like there are still no questions. So I think we can go ahead and wrap up, possibly a few minutes early. So thank you so much, Jack, for sharing your expertise with us today. Following this webinar, all attendees will receive a follow-up email with the slides, the resources handout. Oh, Jack, do you mind muting just for a second? I can hear myself echoing. Following the webinar, all attendees will receive the follow-up email with the slides, the resources handout, and the link to the recording. We also ask that you complete our survey, which will automatically launch after the session. And that is all. So Jack, do you have any final thoughts for our audience today?
Oh, thank you all for attending. Take good care. And thank you, Avery.
Great. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.